Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm sorry to get between you and pudding, but we took a little extra time. Apparently, it came as a great surprise to us all that the Churchillians around the room wanted an extra service of wine, which somewhat delayed it. Now, there's a surprise amongst Churchillians. Let me explain what's going to happen for the second part of this evening. We have two awards this evening, the Statesmanship Award and later a Leadership Award. Then after the first award, Justice Kennedy will come up and he will address us. After that, he and Chris Matthews will have a conversation, although one always wonders what sort of conversation one has with Chris Matthews. Iterative, perhaps not. Then we'll have a second award, the Leadership Award, and all of that will take a few minutes. And after that, we will be doing an after party in the lodge courtyard just outside here, where cigars naturally will be served, as will be copious amounts of booze. Thank you. Okay, we're going to try and push this a little bit, so I'm going to ask, there's going to be service going on while we do the awards and do it. We'll do the best I can, so if everybody can bear with us and understand that we're compressing it because of your drinking habits. Okay, if I could ask Randolph Churchill, wherever he is, Randolph, there is Randolph, if you could come up, and Randolph will announce the Churchill Award for Statesmanship.
Well, what a thrilling evening we've had, and I must say, our ladies look dazzling tonight, so could all the men raise their glasses to our beautiful and dazzling ladies. So the Churchill Award for Statesmanship is given to the person who has given a life of public and civic service. And in this day and age, it is more important than ever. Mitchell Reese. Mitchell. Mitchell, you epitomize those qualities, and it is wonderful what you have done in your career. It's such an inspiration to so many. Your time at the State Department. In my lifetime, the two greatest things that have happened is the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I find it truly remarkable that the daughter of an East Berlin family leads Germany. My great-grandfather would shed a tear for that happening. It's the most moving thing possible. But Reese was involved in what I consider to be the second greatest thing in my lifetime in the last 53 years. I never thought I'd see this happen, but the peace process in Northern Ireland has been one of the greatest success and the inspiration to resolve so many other conflicts. If you can resolve this religious divide, you can resolve any conflict. And his work with that in Northern Ireland and then in North Korea is truly remarkable. And I think that he's a great American spirit and someone who the younger generation would really live up to. So Reese, could you come up and pick your award up, please? Fantastic. Absolutely terrific. Now, I've got one other thing to say, that behind every great man stands a woman, and we'd like Elizabeth to come up for all she does for making her husband's career successful. Elizabeth. Terrific.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I rarely am without words, but I am almost speechless tonight. This is such an extraordinary honor, made more so because of who bestows it. Randolph, you, your family, the Churchill Society, Lawrence and Jenny. Nothing I have ever done is more meaningful than this recognition. So really a great privilege. Thank you so much for recognizing Elizabeth. None of what I have ever accomplished was possible without her. And I'm just so very, very grateful. We are so very, very grateful for you. So thank you so much.
Bravo. Terrific. Fantastic. And look, we've waved the baggage down as well. So,
Was this the one in the Oval Office?
actually, the one in the Oval Office is back there. So you can keep that one. But it's the Oscar Niemann, which is the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well done.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Mitchell. We wanted to give it to Elizabeth, but we didn't dare. I'd like to ask the most wonderful lady, the lady in my life, to come up and introduce Justice Anthony Kennedy. Before she does, though, her great-great-grandmother, Jenny Jerome, was said to have captured the hearts of everybody in London. Well, her great-great-granddaughter has captured my heart, Jenny Churchill.
Thank you, Lawrence. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Justice Anthony Kennedy from Sacramento, California, earned his BA from Stanford University after spending his senior year at the London School of Economics. He then attended Harvard Law School, where he earned his degree in 1961. During the 1960s and 70s, Justice Kennedy worked in private practice in California and was a professor of constitutional law at the University of the Pacific. In 1975, he was nominated by President Gerald Ford to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate. After 12 years of service, Justice Kennedy ascended to the Supreme Court in 1988 when President Reagan nominated him as an Associate Justice. On the occasion of his retirement this past July, after 30 years of service, some of his former clerks ruminated and reminisced about their experiences. They had found in him a leader who never shied away from disagreement, yet sought at all times to avoid being disagreeable. There is no doubt that Justice Kennedy left a lasting imprint on the High Court that few others could or will ever match. Among his many other activities, Justice Kennedy serves on the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation Board of Trustees, where he is chairman of Architecture and Design Review Committee. As such, he has been a consistent driving force behind the architectural vision for the $40 million expansion of the art museums and the renovation of the five-star, five-diamond rated Williamsburg Inn. As those who have worked with him on these and other projects have noted, his mind is something of a steel trap, never forgetting a detail. However, importantly to understand this great man, those who know Anthony Kennedy enjoy his low-key affability. He is a modest and remarkably kind, something people have commented about throughout his long career dedicated to public service. we are very pleased and honored to welcome Justice Kennedy to one of his first major engagements since leaving the Supreme Court. Ladies and gentlemen, Justice Anthony Kennedy.
Thank you so very much. That's most gracious. Good evening. Good evening. Only the trial lawyers need to remain standing. Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you. And it is a singular honor to be introduced by a member of the Churchill family. As a member of the Board of Trustees of Colonial Williamsburg, it is also my privilege to welcome you here. Of course, this is where the founders gave great thought to our Constitution. Their commitment was to secure freedom for themselves and for generations yet to come. And that is the same commitment that Winston Churchill had. The men who drew the Constitution, whether by accident or providence or design, were a brilliant group of people. The comment once was made by Gladstone about the English and the American Constitution, and the first sentence of what he says might strike you as patronizing. He said, the English Constitution was grown, the American Constitution was made. Well, you might think that sounds patronizing, and you could say it in a patronizing tone. But he goes on to pay a supreme compliment to the founders of the United States Constitution. He said, the English Constitution was grown. The American Constitution was made. And just as the English Constitution is the most subtle organism ever to proceed from the womb and gestation of a long progressive history, so is the American Constitution the single most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time from the brain and purpose of man. Winston. Winston Churchill was, of course, a great admirer of the American Constitution and one of the greatest defenders in history of his own. Churchill, of course, knew history, studied history, loved history, made history, embodied history, and he would be so proud to know that you have met here where the history of freedom was reborn. It seems that most speakers at the beginning establish their credentials. In my case, given the distinguished Churchillian scholars here, it seems appropriate to establish my lack of credentials to speak to you. And I can convey that by this story. In post-Churchillian times, in the 80s, Margaret Thatcher asked Ronald Reagan to whom she might talk about the history of American federalism to see if it had any parallels to the European Union. And he suggested graciously that she talk with me, and she and Dennis were very gracious to marry me. We were in 10 Downing Street 3 or 4 different times with them. And one afternoon we were at luncheon in that room where you go to 10 Downing Street is right on your right. And I think there were maybe one or two other couples there, 6 or 8 of us. And the Prime Minister said, well, Anthony, what are you going to be doing this weekend? And I said, well, we're going to Chequers. And she said, oh. And I said, my continued response was, yes, we want to see where Churchill lived and the paintings he did and the wall that he built. And she said, you mean Chartwell? She said, when you said you were going to Chequers, you invited yourself to my home. And of course, everybody laughed except me. My flesh got very red. And then she graciously said, but you shall come, you shall come. And indeed, we were invited some months later, but then suddenly she was no longer Prime Minister. And so we never, if some of you can arrange for me to go to Chequers, just give me a call. One of the things that we discussed in our conversations was my comment that if England joined the euro, at that time the European Union was ready to establish the euro, it would be quite inconsistent with the United States idea of a single currency. My comment was that because this nation had a single currency, it was very, very strong. And if England joined the euro, it would be highly restrictive of England's ability to negotiate with the European Union. And apparently other people gave her that same advice. One of my other comments was that, of course, you will have international courts that will undercut the idea of parliamentary supremacy, and that's inevitable. And it's interesting that Prime Minister Churchill knew that this would happen because of international covenants, which are enforceable by international courts. In 1948, he was not Prime Minister at the time, but he was invited to what they called the Congress of Europe in The Hague, where they discussed the plans for the Council of Europe and the European Convention on Human Rights. And Churchill made a very valuable contribution. Now, to simplify a little bit, if you talk about constitutional rights, they're roughly in 2 orders. One are negative prohibitions. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise clause. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. No person shall be condemned to life or to be condemned to punishment for life or limb and be put twice in jeopardy. No warrant shall issue except upon probable cause. Negative prohibitions. But if you go down the streets in Washington on a cold winter day and you see some homeless person trying to keep warm on a sting grate, you say, now here's the Constitution of the United States. You have a right to free speech, and there can be no warrant issued except upon probable cause, and you can't be put twice in jeopardy of life or limb. He said, look, I'm cold and I'm hungry. And for some years, there has been a considerable advocacy for so-called positive entitlements in constitutions. In the 70s and 80s, again post-Churchillian, we saw this in Eastern Europe, in South America, in the far Pacific, where new constitutions were being proposed, and they had entitlement rights, positive rights, the right to food, to shelter, to health care, to education. And a number of us who were commenting on these proposed constitutions explained that these could not be judicially enforceable. If they were, it would involve courts in allocation of funding, which was a quintessentially political process. Then the draftsmen, or proponents of the Constitution, told me, they said, well, we can't get the Constitution enacted if we don't have this. And our suggestion was, we'll make them precatory, aspirational, say this is what we want to do, but they're not judicially enforceable. At the Council of Europe, Churchill in 1948 was very prescient about this exact problem. He strongly believed that there should be an international convention in Europe to protect human rights. But he advocated that they be these negative rights. He did not want positive rights, which meant permanent big government, and very unclear as to whether or not they're judicially enforceable. So his strategy was to argue for the inclusion of negative rights in these covenants, and that came to be, because of Churchill's suggestions as well as many others, the European Convention on Human Rights. It was opened for signature for accession in Rome in 1950, and England became a signatory. It is indeed true that as a result, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg can issue opinions invalidating laws enacted by the Parliament. So the idea of parliamentary supremacy has been compromised in international documents. Churchill was a very strong believer in parliamentary supremacy. He gave a fascinating speech to the American Bar Association in 1954, being very gracious. He didn't criticize the United States judicial supremacy rule, the idea that a court can declare invalid an enactment of a 5-4 decision can declare invalid an act enacted by the entire Congress and signed by the President. That's judicial review. He explained that he thought this was necessary, or certainly defensible, because of our federal system, because of our size, but he defended very strongly, the idea of parliamentary supremacy. This did not mean that he was not a defender of the judiciary. Churchill was one of the great defenders of an independent judiciary. In England, I was interested to find out that in 1954, there was a proposal to raise judicial salaries, but the Parliament, including many members of Churchill's own party, didn't want to do it because the judge's salary was linked to their own. And they didn't have the political will or maybe the funds to raise their own, but they didn't want to lose the judges that anchored. And we've seen the same thing in the United States. And Churchill gave a magnificent speech saying that it would be a slur on the reputation of this great house if self-interest of parliamentary members impaired the independence of the judiciary of England. And English judges to this day are admired the world over for their independence. Some years ago, Chief Justice Warren Burger, then Chief Justice of the United States, was invited by Lord Hailsham to go to the opening of the Inns of Court. Begins at Michaelmas term. Michaelmas term is, I think, earlier, mid-October. The reason being that in former times, the young men that wanted to be barristers were in London, but they had to go home to help with the harvest. They wouldn't be back till October, so that's the opening of the Michaelmas term. And what happens is they go into Westminster Abbey, and there's a procession with the English judges in all of their finery, led by the Lord Chancellor. And the Lord Chancellor invited Warren Burger to walk beside him, going down the aisle of Westminster Abbey with all the judges behind him. And Berger was just thrilled with it. Berger looked like he was right out of central casting. I mean, he just and so Lord Hailsham was a very friendly man. And the first group in the church in the back were Americans and other foreign visitors. And then the next group was the Labor shadow government. They were out of office. But the shadow prime minister was Neil Kinnock. And so they were walking in, and the Lord Chancellor said, "Neil." And the Americans got down and genuflected. And Warren Berger loved it. He said, "Now you know what they do over there in England. You know, the judges, some of the people, they'll kneel down." So I said, "You tell him, I'm not going to tell him." But Churchill was a great defender of the judiciary, of the independence of the judiciary, but also a great defender of parliamentary supremacy, and that is your tradition until this day. I noticed that we have the Statesman Award. Not long ago, it occurred to me that we have difficulty producing or identifying statesmen or stateswomen in our era, both here and abroad. And it occurred to me that it might be interesting to define what a statesman or a stateswoman is. Rufus Fears, the late professor of history and government at University of Oklahoma, made a suggestion, and my suggestion follows it. I should have had a PowerPoint for you, but this is simple enough. And I changed it a little bit, his idea. Number one, a statesman should have a moral compass, a moral framework. Number two, a statesman or a stateswoman should have vision, the ability to see the opportunity for a great advance in human progress, or the ability to see the portents of grave danger. And third, the statesman or stateswoman should have the capacity, the genius for forming a consensus across party lines. And it seems to me probably, and I wish we could talk about this more so I could get your advice, you could add that he or she has to have the leadership ability to make it come about. I'm not sure the last is really necessary if you have a marvelous, say, U.S. senator or congressman or parliamentarian who has a brilliant idea and gets consensus. Maybe they're not the ones to carry it out, but whatever. The fourth element, it seems to me, important. Now, what about Churchill's moral framework? Again, you can teach me so much. But Churchill once said that with respect to religion, he wasn't a pillar of the Anglican Church, he was a buttress because he was supported it from the outside. But it seems to me that Churchill's moral framework was directed in large part toward to his unyielding belief in the rule of law and the idea of freedom. And he knew that this was the great contribution that England made to its people and to the rest of the world. In 2015, 3 years ago, we had the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. And as important as we said it was, it seems to me it was grossly understated. Magna Carta, for its time, was unique. You had great law documents, the Ten Commandments, the Babylonian Code, Code of Hammurabi, the 12 Tables, Justinian's Code. But all of these were laws given by the ruler to the people. Magna Carta was the other way around. Magna Carta affirmed. Magna Carta established. Magna Carta proved. Magna Carta insisted that the law comes from the people to the king, not the other way around. And this was Churchill's strong belief. He believed in the rule of law. He believed in the English tradition of law. He believed that this was one of the great gifts to his own nation and to his own people. I shouldn't go on too much longer, but in the ability to have consensus was something marvelous that Churchill taught us and accomplished. One time in 1940, I think it was February 1940, Wendell Willkie, who'd lost the election to Roosevelt, was given a letter of introduction to Churchill that Roosevelt wrote out in his own hand. And Roosevelt quoted from Longfellow's Ship of State. This is a very long poem about building a ship. It talks about hammers and saws and all. But the few lines that Roosevelt quoted were, "Sail on, O ship of state, sail on. Sail on, O united great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all its hopes of future years, hangs breathless on thy fate." Churchill read this letter from Roosevelt to Churchill to the House of Commons. Now look at, here's the House of Commons hearing a letter from an American president with an American poet, not Andrew Marvell or William Shakespeare or Lord Tennyson, an American poet, Longfellow. Churchill then follows it up by saying, what answer shall we give? And the answer gives, we shall not falter, we shall not fail. We shall not tire. Give us the tools and we shall do the job. The tools being the hammer and saw that Longfellow talked about, but also obviously the tools that needed to win the war. This was his marvelous capacity to build consensus. And of course, he had the magnificent sense of balance and decency of the British people to help him. One time, when I was in London in the 50s, the English pacifist movement was at its height. And they had brilliant leaders, Bertrand Russell, A.J.P. Taylor. They had a rally, and the specific issue was they didn't want nuclear weapons on British soil, so the movement was called Ban the Bomb, and they had signs saying, "Ban the bomb." So there was a meeting at Victoria and Albert Hall with A.J.P. Taylor and Bertrand Russell and the speakers, and it was important for me to go, it seems, so I could understand what they were talking about, but I didn't agree with them, so I was way off on the side. And they had the rally, and then it was suggested that we should all go to 10 Downing Street, there to reassemble and there to demonstrate. And it took kind of an hour to do this. I don't know how you got from Victoria and Albert Hall to 10 Downing, but everyone knew, especially those of us who were on immigrant visas, that this was a violation of the law. You cannot demonstrate, in those days at least, within a certain radius, a mile or something, of Parliament when it's sitting, and 10 Downing Street is within the prohibited zone. So this was a violation of the law. But again, I wanted to see what happened, so I came along. And in order, again, to show that I wasn't part of this group, there was a little lawn as you turn into 10 Downing Street, and I stood off on the lawn. And so there people were shouting, "Ban the bomb," and the police commander, police captain came on this horse with the other bobbies, and he was arguing with the fellow with the sign, and they looked over at me. And the police officer went down and he held the man's sign, and the man came over and said, "I beg your pardon, sir, you really must stand off the grass." Well, now you see, You can break the law, but you have to do it in a decent way. This was the gift, the English people that Churchill knew, that Churchill understood. And again, for us, Churchill embodies the idea of a commitment to the law, of a commitment to peace, of a commitment to freedom. And he would agree, I think, if we said that the work of freedom is never done. Thank you for thinking about it and talking about it here this evening. Thank you.
Chris?
As long as 10 minutes.
10 minutes. When you finish, stay there. I've got the ball for Justice.
Thank you, Justice.
You can afford my hourly rate.
We've got we have. Thank you, Randolph. We have 10 minutes. You know, I often think about the 20s and the great composers. We had Kern, Jerome Kern. We had Gershwin. We had all at the same time. All the Astaire Rogers movies, all that music was just at one time. Where did all that magic come from at one time? And then I was thinking, why did we have the magic in the late 18th century? Why so much genius at the same time? Why Madison? Why Jefferson? Why Ben Franklin? What happened in our country that made that all happen?
Accident, providence, design, of course. The Enlightenment changed the way we think about thought, just as the cyber age does, and we can talk about that later. Newton, for over a century, was the most popular person in the world. People hadn't read his great scientific work, but this idea that the apple falls and the human mind of its own accord can know what the law is, this was liberating. And this dynamism of the Enlightenment drove people to write and to think on their own. They didn't need help from a church. They didn't need help from the government. They could think on their own, Chris. And they wrote, Franklin wrote thousands of letters. Adams, the same. And they were great writers. And I think it was that Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment just didn't come from England here. It worked. The framers, as sons of the Enlightenment, were fascinated with all sorts of clocks and wheels and gears and pendulums. And that's why the American Constitution has a certain Newtonian metaphor to it. Checks them out. The Congress enacts, the president vetoes, the Congress overrides, the courts refuse, like a pendulum or a clock. They were astute experts and students of human behavior. They knew that a paper document couldn't control human emotions unless there was also a commitment, a human commitment. But there is that Newtonian metaphor, and I think it was part of the Enlightenment.
Let's bounce around to more recent history. Ronald Reagan appointed you. Tell me, you were friends with Ron. Tell us about Ronald Reagan for a few minutes, because there's a guy who was an autodidact. He didn't have a great formal education. He taught himself so much. His writing was great. We found all his original writing from the 50s when he was writing his column all by himself. It wasn't edited by anyone, really.
Right.
What did you think about it? How did you think Reagan, because he played such a big role in the end of the Cold War in modern conservatism, and he's ranked now among the top presidents. What did you know about him that we don't know?
Well,
Who picked you?
he knew what he believed, and he believed what he believed. I had good access to him. I had done a few little legal things for him and lived in Sacramento. And he and Nancy liked Mary very much. And I told him, you know, there's two things you can never ask me. He said, oh, what's that? and I said, one, you can't ask me about politics. I don't know anything about it. You know, I was a practitioner. I was a business lawyer. And plus, he had Ed Rollins and Holmes Tuttle and Justin Dart and Ed Meese and Mike Dee, one of the great political teams ever since. And he said, what's the other thing I can't ask you about? I said, don't ever ask me who should be appointed a judge. I appear in these state courts. Sacramento was kind of a headquarters for a lot of the rural counties. And I appeared in those courts. And if you get the reputation, Chris, as a judge maker or a judge breaker, it's not good for a relation you have with the bench. You're afraid he's going to bend over backwards for you, which you don't really want, or against you, so whatever. So I had good access to him. One time, I was in his office early on, and Deaver came rushing in. And I said, Governor, he said, your friends from Hollywood are here. He said, oh, what do they want? And he said, well, we thought they were coming tomorrow. We didn't have time. They'll tell you it's not. So in comes John Wayne, Henry Fonda, and Charlton Heston. I told the governor I'll leave. He said, no, I need to see you and Deaver. So they do the Hollywood thing, how good everybody looks. But you would never slap Reagan on the shoulder. It's kind of like George Washington. Reagan had this distance. You shake hand. And in part because he was an old softy, you know, he'd tear up, so he kept this distance. But anyway, they sat down. He said, oh, what brings you to Sacramento? And they said, we're here about the Arts Commission. He said, well, what's the Arts Commission? He said, well, it's a state commission that gives funds for poets and playwrights and sculptors and novelists and artists. And the legislature is cutting their budget. I forget the numbers. I make it up from $18 million to $14 million. And Reagan said, oh, I'm glad you told me that. I'm against that. And they said, okay, then we'll get the 18. He said, no, I'll veto the 14. They said, no. We have the 14. We need the 18. Well, the world's most unsuccessful lobbying commission begins to unfold before my eyes. He said, no, now, if we start saying what's good art and what's bad art, that's not for the government to do. That's not much money. You can go do that. And veto the whole thing. Now, you might agree or disagree with it, but he knew what he believed. He believed what he believed. And frankly, was right. You know, so many people, Chris, you're, of course, a great proponent, a great defender, as you ought to be, of the First Amendment. So many people think the First Amendment is moral relativism. The Supreme Court writes a book. Oh, every book is as good as every other book. Every film is as good as every other film. Well, that's a bunch of junk. Well, the First Amendment is moral relevant. All the First Amendment says is the government doesn't tell you. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't tell you. And the very fact that the government can't be involved means you should be involved. And then the next time you see a TV show where they're reviewing a book or a movie or something, and it's absolute trash, someone will say, oh, there's a First Amendment right. I know there's a First Amendment right. It's junk. And this culture is becoming vulgar. And this culture is one which should not embrace moral relativism. That's not what the First Amendment says. The First Amendment says the government doesn't make this, but you can and you should and you must in order to improve the rest of the world is looking at the United States to see what freedom looks like. And it's up to us to show a culture, a discourse, a civic dialogue that's enviable and admirable. And your contribution to that. And, you know, and they mix this up.
I know people think if it's legal, it's okay.
Right.
Just to make it okay. Let me ask you about you. And you are beloved on the liberal side for your decisions on the Lawrence case, on same-sex, on Casey, on the no undue burden on a right to abortion. On those issues, you're not liked so much on Citizens United and some of the other decisions you made. I think you're a conservative. And I'd like, well, first of all, I ask that question to you. Are you a conservative? Is that a fair reputation for you?
I'm not sure. I'm a conservative in that I am suspicious of big government. I'm conservative in that I think no government has ever given you freedom unless you have some rights of property. And most zoning experts think they own your property. So I'm conservative in that, but I think a conservative really has the duty to embrace change so that the basic ideas can remain in force. And the framers use words like life, liberty, property. Those are expansive. If the framers knew all of the specifics, all of the details of a just society, they would have written them out. They didn't. They knew that wisdom comes to you over time. And they were not presumptuous enough to say that we know what you should do in the next 50, 100, now 200 plus years. They used these magnificent but general phrases, knowing that the whole idea of human freedom, of human knowledge, is that we understand ourselves over time.
Thank you. Thank you, Justice. Thank you, Justice Kennedy.
Didn't you have something more that you wanted to say? I didn't remember.
All right, you want more? Yeah.
No, I wanted you to talk. Did you agree with
No,
that?
because I think Churchillian and British Tory philosophy about conservatism is not hold the line. It's understanding how to preserve the cohesion of society by making changes. And recognize, and to me, same-sex marriage keeps society together. It allows marriage to replace the bathhouses, if you will, replaces promiscuity. I think it's a very conservative doctrine. And I think on abortion rights, and you and I may have the same moral view of it, but legally, I cannot imagine a limited government being able to stop people from having abortions. And we all want a limited government.
One of my favorite scenes in movies is Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Yeah. And it's Spencer Tracy, and he has, 24 hours or 8 hours to make up his mind about interracial marriage. And he finally he hears all this stuff, and he goes out on the terrace in San Francisco, overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, and he's thinking to himself, and always says, I'll be darned. A judge must always ask herself, why am I about to do this? And you owe that to the litigants. You owe the litigant the duty every time that litigant comes before you of asking yourself anew why you are doing this. And this is the oath that you take, and sometimes you surprise yourself. In the gay marriage case you mentioned, we found out that there were over 100,000 young children who were the children of gay parents. And to say that they should be stigmatized by a governmental action seemed to be wrong.
You know, I was watching Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in Swaziland, Africa, in a theater filled with Africans. And when Spencer Tracy ruled at the end, and he was the one holding back on the
yeah.
When because Katharine Hepburn was for it and all. And then she weakened and he got strong. He said, these people are in love. And then he goes, and the guy, African in front of him, and he said, he talks like a judge. So it's right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Justice. Thank you. Thank you. I'll get off the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Please sit down. Justice Kennedy commented that leadership could well be part of statesmanship. I would argue that statesmanship is certainly part of leadership. And we have our National Leadership Award presentation tonight. And there's no question that Justice Kennedy has proven himself a natural leader. He builds consensus and has done all his career. He has been the quintessential statesman on the Supreme Court. He has never been afraid to lead, and he has never lost his moral compass and has always known where his true north is. That's a leader, and Justice Kennedy is a leader, and it's my privilege tonight to give him the Winston S. Churchill National Leadership Award.
Oh, this is thank you so very, very much. Thank you very, very much.
And Justice Kennedy, this comes with it. I can hold it for about 10 seconds, so I think we'll give it to you later.
It's excellent. This is beautiful, and I will hold it in trust for all that we believe in for freedom. Thank you. Oh, hold it, don't.
Thank you.
Well, how gracious of you. Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd all sit for one last second, I'm sorry for those that are getting dessert late or pudding late. If I had to choose between your pudding and Justice Kennedy, I'm afraid your pudding lost. We come to the end of our proceedings here tonight. I thank you for your patience. Justice Kennedy, Chris, Randolph, Jenny, thank you for being part of this. Minnie, Craig, thank you for doing the toasts. Edwina, thank you for causing trouble. I stand personally in awe of all of your commitment to the cause I've devoted 30-odd years to. I am bewildered why each of us has our own motives for Churchill and for what we do. But it is clear when you look around this room that we can't all be wrong. Jenny tells me I normally am. But we can't all be wrong. Our cause is just. Churchill was a great man. We have much to learn. And each year we learn more, and more people follow his moral compass. Outside, booze, cigars, fireplaces, and a clear night await. Thank you all for coming this evening.